The rain started on a Tuesday. Not the gentle patter that lulls you to sleep, but the persistent, invasive kind that seeps into the corners of your mind. Ethan Caro stood at his kitchen window, coffee cooling in his hand, watching droplets race down the glass like they were desperate to escape something above. There was something about that morning that felt off, a dissonance in the familiar routine that he couldn't quite place. Maybe it was the way his wedding ring felt heavier on his finger, or how the silence in his empty house seemed to have texture for the first time in years. He had always been a man of patterns. Wake at 6:15, shower for exactly 7 minutes, coffee while checking emails. By 7:30, he would be at his drafting table, the technical illustrations for various engineering firms taking shape under his practiced hand. Working from home had its rhythms, and after 15 years, Ethan had perfected them. But that Tuesday in November, as rain plastered the fallen leaves to his backyard deck, the pattern felt like it was being rewritten by something just outside his peripheral vision. The first hint came when he opened his front door to collect the mail. The wooden side gate to his backyard was ajar, just slightly, but enough to catch his attention. The old latch that had needed WD-40 for months now hung loose, rainwater dripping from its metal tongue. Ethan stared at it for a moment too long. He had checked it the night before, hadn't he? A habit born from that incident 3 summers ago, when neighborhood kids had left it open and his German Shepherd Max had gotten out. Max wasn't around anymore. Arthritis and age had taken him last winter, but the habit remained locked in his muscle memory. Ethan set his coffee down on the porch railing, rain immediately diluting the dark liquid, and walked over to the gate. The grass in his side yard was soaked, forming small puddles in the uneven ground. His slippers grew heavy with moisture as he reached for the latch and clicked it back into place. It was probably nothing. The wind last night had been strong enough to rattle the windows. It could have easily nudged the gate open. But as he turned back toward his porch, something caught his eye near the fence line. A depression in the wet. Grass like someone had stepped there recently. Too large to be from a neighborhood cat or raccoon. The rain was filling it slowly, erasing whatever evidence might have been there. He shook his head and returned to his coffee, now a tepid, watery mess. His drafting table was waiting, and he had 2 projects due by the end of the week. No time for the imagination to wander. The morning passed in a blur of precise lines and measurements, the sound of rain against the roof providing a soothing backdrop to his work. By noon, the clouds had darkened further, turning the day into a premature dusk. Ethan switched on his desk lamp, the yellow light creating a small island in his otherwise dim home office. The rest of the house remained dark, a habit of frugality he'd developed after the divorce 3 years ago. What was the point of lighting rooms nobody was in? His concentration broke when his phone buzzed with a notification, a text from his sister, Rachel. "Did you check that thing I mentioned?" Ethan frowned. He scrolled up through their conversation history, but found nothing about her asking him to check something. He typed back, "What thing?" 3 dots appeared, immediately, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, "Sorry, wrong message, meant for Mark." Mark was her husband. Ethan set his phone down, but something about the exchange left him uneasy. Rachel wasn't the type to make such mistakes. She was methodical, organized, traits they both inherited from their father. But people make errors, especially on rainy days when the world feels slightly off-kilter. He returned to his work, but found it harder to focus. The rain had intensified, drumming against the house with a strange urgency. Twice he caught himself staring out the window at the blurred outline of his backyard. At the gate, he couldn't quite see from this angle. Both times he forced his attention back to the technical specifications on his screen. It was during a client Zoom call that the second strange thing happened. As Ethan explained the modifications to a hydraulic pump, design movement outside his window pulled at his peripheral vision. He turned slightly, maintaining his professional demeanor as the client spoke, and through the rain-streaked glass, he saw a dark figure standing at the edge of his property line. Just for a moment. There, then gone. "Mr. Caro, do you agree with that approach?" Ethan snapped his attention back to the screen, where his client, a balding man with perpetually concerned eyebrows, was waiting for a response. "Yes, absolutely. The modification will increase efficiency without compromising the safety parameters. The call continued, but Ethan's mind kept drifting to that shape in the rain. Probably just the old maple tree, its branches weighted with water, creating an illusion of human form. That had to be it. Trees moved in strange ways during storms. After the call ended, he found himself walking to the back door and peering out through the glass. The rain created a distorted lens, transforming his familiar yard into something alien. The maple tree stood where it always had, branches swaying. Slightly. Nothing unusual. No dark figure. No reason for the unease that had settled into his stomach like a cold stone. He returned to his desk, but found the silence of the house suddenly oppressive. He switched on a podcast, something about historical engineering failures, and let the voices fill the space as he worked. The afternoon stretched on, marked only by the shifting patterns of rain against his windows and the occasional distant rumble of thunder. At 4:15 p.m. he remembered to check his voicemail. There were 2 messages. The first was from his ex-wife, Caroline. Something about tax documents she needed. He would deal with that tomorrow. The second message made him pause, finger hovering over the delete button. Hi, Ethan. I know this might sound odd, but did someone from your house come by this morning around 10? It was raining and I saw someone standing at your back gate for a while. Just standing there. I thought maybe it was you, but it didn't look like you. Sorry if I'm being silly. Hope all is well. Mrs. Fallow, the elderly widow who lived 2 houses down. She was in her 70s now, her eyesight not what it used to be. But she'd always been kind to Ethan, bringing over cookies when Caroline left, offering to watch Max when Ethan had to, travel for work conferences. He played the message again, listening more carefully to the uncertain tremor in her voice. 10 o'clock. He had been on a call with a client in Seattle at that time, never leaving his desk. And he lived alone. Ethan walked to the window again, pulling back the blinds to look at his backyard. The gate was closed, just as he had left it that morning. The rain had stopped momentarily, though the clouds remained dense overhead, promising more to come. The grass was saturated, small puddles reflecting the grey sky. He should call Mrs. Fallow back, reassure her. Maybe one of the neighbor's kids had wandered into his yard, or perhaps it was a delivery person, confused about an address. There were logical explanations, but before he could reach for his phone, the rain resumed, a sudden downpour that seemed to isolate his house further from the world. And in that moment, standing at his window watching water sluice off his roof in sheets, Ethan felt a peculiar certainty that something fundamental had changed in his life. Not dramatically like the day Caroline had told him she was leaving, but subtly. A small recalibration of reality that would reveal its significance only in retrospect. He decided to check his home security footage. The system wasn't elaborate, just 3 cameras he'd installed after the divorce, when the house had started to feel too empty, too vulnerable. 1 at the front door, 1 covering the driveway, and 1 on the side of the house aimed at the backyard gate. He opened the app on his laptop, navigating to that morning's timeline. The front door camera showed nothing unusual, just rain and Ethan himself collecting the mail, pausing, then walking toward the gate. The driveway remained empty except for his Honda CR-V, water pooling around its tires. But when he clicked on the side camera, he found that the footage from 9:47 a.m. to 10:12 a.m. was missing. The timeline showed a gap, jumping from Ethan checking the gate latch that morning, directly to an empty, rain-soaked yard, almost 30 minutes later. A perfectly timed malfunction. He ran the system's diagnostic tool. Everything reported normal. Function? No errors, no indication of why that specific time period would be missing. Just a digital black hole where 25 minutes of his life should have been. Ethan leaned back in his chair, listening to the rain hammer his roof. He could call the security company, but what would he say? That his elderly neighbor saw someone in his yard during the exact window of time his camera mysteriously failed. That he had a feeling, an inexplicable certainty, that something wasn't right. They would offer to send a technician, charge him a service fee, and find nothing wrong. Instead, he took his phone and texted Rachel again. Strange question, but did you or Mark come by my house today? Her response came quickly. No, why? Everything okay? He didn't know how to answer that. Was everything okay? Probably. Most likely this was nothing. A series of minor coincidences, colliding on a rainy day when his imagination was running a bit wild. So he typed, "All good. Just thought I saw someone in the yard earlier. Probably nothing." Her next message arrived as he was heating up leftover pasta for dinner. "Want me to come over? I can be there in 40 mins." Rachel lived in Salem, almost an hour away in good weather, longer in rain like this. The fact that she'd offer to drive out on a Tuesday evening over something so vague was both touching and slightly alarming. Did his message sound more distressed than he'd intended? "No need," he texted back. "Just being paranoid, probably the storm playing tricks." He ate dinner at his drafting table, reviewing a schematic while half watching a documentary on his second monitor. Normal routine, nothing unusual. The rational part of his brain told him to let it go, to chalk up the day's unease to weather and isolation. But another part, a more primitive, instinctual part, kept him glancing toward the windows, studying the reflections, listening too intently to the sounds of the house settling around him. By 10 p.m., the storm had intensified again. Wind drove, the rain horizontally against his windows, and thunder rolled overhead in sustained, ominous waves. Ethan found himself checking all the doors and windows before bed, another routine, but performed with more attention than usual. The side gate, latch visible from his kitchen window, remained closed. Everything was secure, safe. Still, sleep came fitfully. He dreamed of standing in his yard in the rain, looking back at his house, seeing a figure that was both himself and not himself, watching from the office window. In the dream, he tried to call out, to ask what was happening, but the rain swallowed. His voice and the figure in the window simply turned away, as if losing interest in what might happen to the version of himself stranded outside. He woke at 3:17 a.m. to the sound of his security system chiming, the soft alert that signaled a door or window opening. For a moment, he lay frozen in bed, heart hammering against his ribs. Then he reached for his phone on the nightstand, opening the security app with trembling fingers. The notification was for the back door, opened at 3:16 a.m. Ethan sat up, fully awake now. His bedroom was on the second floor, at the front of the house. The back door was downstairs, past the kitchen. He strained to listen over the sound of rain, trying to detect movement, but the storm obliterated any subtle sounds that might carry through the house. He should call the police. That would be the rational response. But something held him back, the same instinct that had been nagging at him all day. Instead, he quietly slid open his nightstand drawer and removed the small canister of pepper spray he'd bought after the divorce. Not because he feared Caroline, but because the house had felt too large, too empty, too exposed at night. Moving silently, Ethan crept to his bedroom door and eased it open. The hallway was dark, but a faint glow came from downstairs. Not the harsh beam of a flashlight, but a softer illumination, as if someone had turned on the small lamp in the living room, the one Caroline had bought at that antique store in Seattle, with the stained glass shade that cast patterns on the wall. Ethan made his way down the stairs, avoiding the third step that always creaked. At the bottom, he paused, listening. The lull. Rain continued its assault on the roof and windows, but beneath it, he thought he heard something else. Breathing, or perhaps just the central heating cycling on. He moved through the darkened dining room toward the kitchen, pepper spray clutched. In his sweating palm, the soft light was indeed coming from the living room beyond. As he approached the doorway between the kitchen and living room, he caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow shifting across the wall. Someone was in his house. Ethan pressed himself against the wall, trying to control his breathing. Call the police! The rational part of his mind screamed, but another voice, quieter yet more insistent, told him to look first, to understand what was happening before inviting others into this strange night. He peered around the corner, into the living room. The lamp was on, casting its familiar amber glow across the space. And there, sitting on his couch with hands folded neatly in lap, was Mrs. Fallow. Her grey hair was plastered to her skull, her clothes soaked through. A puddle was forming on the hardwood floor beneath her feet. She was staring at the blank television screen as if watching a fascinating program. "Mrs. Fallow?" Ethan's voice came out as a whisper. She didn't respond, didn't even blink, just continued staring at the black screen of the TV. "Mrs. Fallow," he said again, louder this time, stepping into the room. "Are you okay? What are you doing here?" Slowly, she turned her head toward him. Her eyes were wide, unblinking. "It's looking for you," she said, her voice oddly flat. "I told it you weren't home, but it didn't believe me." A chill ran through Ethan that had nothing to do with the rain-dampened air. "What's looking for me? Mrs. Fallow, you're soaking wet. How did you get in here?" She smiled then, a strange, disconnected expression that didn't reach her eyes. "The door was open. It's always open in the rain." Ethan took another step closer, concerned now that she might be having some kind of medical episode, dementia perhaps, or a stroke. She was in her 70s, living alone. "Let me call an ambulance." "Okay, you shouldn't be out in this weather." Her smile faded, replaced by a look of confusion. "Ambulance?" She glanced around the room as if seeing it for the first time. "Oh dear. Ethan, what am I doing in your house?" The shift was so sudden, so complete, that Ethan found himself speechless for a moment. The vacant stare was gone, replaced by the familiar, slightly confused gaze of his elderly neighbor. I don't know, Mrs. Fallow. I found you sitting here. Do you remember how you got here?" She shook her head slowly, drops of water flying from her wet hair. "The last thing I remember is going to bed. I took my pill and turned out the light." Her voice quavered. "How did I get here?" "I'm going to call for help," Ethan said, reaching for his phone. But Mrs. Fallow's hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. "Don't," she said, urgency in her voice. "Please don't call anyone. I'm so embarrassed. This has happened before." "What has?" "Sleepwalking. After Harold died, it started. The doctor gave me pills and it stopped. But sometimes when it rains hard like this," she trailed off, looking down at her soaked clothing as if just realizing her condition. "Oh my. I'm ruining your floor." Ethan's mind raced. Sleepwalking. Could explain it. Elderly people sometimes experienced confusion, especially those living alone. But how had she gotten into his house? And what was that strange, vacant look? The odd things she'd said? "Let me drive you home," he offered. "And maybe we should call your doctor in the morning." She nodded, seeming relieved at the suggestion. "Yes, thank you. I'm sorry about this, Ethan. So sorry to frighten you." "It's okay. Let me get you a towel and a jacket." As Ethan went to the hall closet, his security app chimed again on his phone. He checked it quickly. Back door closed 3:31 a.m., but he hadn't heard it open or close. The storm must have masked the sound. He returned with a large towel and an old raincoat that had belonged to Caroline. Mrs. Fallow accepted them gratefully, drying her hair and wrapping the coat around her thin shoulders. "Thank you, dear. You're always so kind." She looked up at him, her eyes now clear and present. "Has it stopped yet?" "The rain?" "No, it's still coming down pretty hard." She shook her head. "Not the rain, the visits." Something in her tone made Ethan's skin prickle. "Visits? From the boy, the one who looks like you but isn't you, the one who stands at the gate in the rain." Ethan felt his mouth go dry. "Mrs. Fallow, what boy?" But she only smiled vacantly and pulled the coat tighter around her shoulders. "We should go now. It's late and the rain brings things out that should stay hidden." The drive to Mrs. Fallow's house took less than a minute, but it felt longer, with the rain hammering the windshield and his elderly neighbor sitting silently beside him, staring straight ahead. As they pulled into her driveway, Ethan noticed that her front door was slightly ajar, light spilling out into the night. "Your door is open," he said. She nodded, unsurprised. "I must have left that way." She turned to him, her expression suddenly clear and focused. "Ethan, be careful. The rain changes things, makes doors where there shouldn't be any." Before he could ask what she meant, she had opened the car door and was hurrying through the downpour toward her house, still wrapped in Caroline's coat. Ethan watched until she was safely inside, the door closed behind her. Then he sat in his driveway. For a long moment, listening to the rain and the rhythmic sweep of his windshield wipers. What had just happened? Was it as simple as an elderly woman with a history of sleepwalking? Or was something else occurring? Something connected to the open gate, the missing security footage, the figure he thought he'd seen at the edge of his yard? He drove back to his own house, headlights cutting through sheets of water that seemed to be growing heavier by the minute. The weather report had mentioned the possibility of flooding in low-lying areas. His neighborhood wasn't in a flood zone, but with rain this persistent, who knew? Back home, Ethan checked all the doors and windows again, paying special attention to the back door. It was securely locked, with no signs of forced entry. The security system showed no further alerts. Just the two. Back door opened at 3:16 a.m., closed at 3:31 a.m., coinciding perfectly with Mrs. Fallow's mysterious visit. Sleep was out of the question now. Instead, Ethan made a fresh pot of coffee and sat at his kitchen table, watching the eastern sky gradually lighten from black to deep charcoal as dawn approached. The rain continued unabated, a constant backdrop to his troubled thoughts. At 6:15 a.m., his usual wake-up time, Ethan was still at the kitchen table on his third cup of coffee when the doorbell rang. He jumped, nearly knocking over his mug. Who would be at his door at this hour in this weather? Moving to the front window, he peered out, half expecting to see Mrs. Fallow again, perhaps return to some sleepwalking state. But there was no one on his porch, just rain falling in heavy sheets from the early morning sky. The security app on his phone showed no alerts for the front door. He checked the doorbell camera. Nothing. No one had been captured approaching. His porch. Yet the doorbell had rung. He was certain of it. Ethan opened the front door cautiously, looking out at the empty porch. The rain immediately blew in, dampening his face and the entryway floor. He was about to close the door when he noticed something on the welcome mat, a padded manila envelope thoroughly soaked. He picked it up gingerly. No address label, no postage. Just a plain, waterlogged envelope that someone had left at his doorstep. The flap was unsealed, the adhesive likely compromised by the rain. Back in the kitchen, Ethan set the envelope on the table and carefully opened it. Inside was a single item, a black and white photograph, its edges curling from moisture, but the image itself still intact. He slid it out onto the table. The photo showed a small group of people standing near a chain-link fence in the rain. 5 figures, their faces blurred by what looked like water damage or exposure issues. All except one, a boy, perhaps 12 or 13, standing slightly apart from the others. His face was clear, his expression unreadable as he stared directly at the camera. Something about the boy's posture, the set of his shoulders, the angle of his head, it looked familiar in a way that made Ethan's stomach tighten. The resemblance to himself at that age was unsettling. The same cowlick in the hair, the same slightly too large ears that he had grown into by high school. But Ethan had no memory of this photograph, of this moment. He didn't recognize the fence, the other blurred figures, or any context that might explain why a water-damaged photo of a boy who looked like him had been left at his door on this strange, rain-soaked morning. He turned the photo over. On the back, in fading blue ink, was written, Tillamook, 1996. Tillamook. The coastal forest area west of Portland. Ethan had gone camping there with his family when he was young. His father had been an avid outdoorsman, taking them on weekend trips whenever work allowed. But 1996, Ethan would have been 13 then. He tried to recall a specific Tillamook trip from that year, but the camping excursions blended together in his memory. All rain-dampened tents, uncomfortable sleeping bags, and his father's relentless enthusiasm for connecting with nature. Ethan placed the photo under his desk lamp, studying it more carefully. The chain-link fence seemed to enclose some kind of facility, not a typical forest campground. And the other figures, though their faces were obscured, appeared to be adults, based on their height and build. Was one of them his father? His mother? He couldn't tell. The boy, though. The boy was definitely looking at the camera with an intensity that seemed out of place for a casual photo. Not smiling, not posing, just staring, as if trying to communicate something important through the lens. A sudden chill ran through Ethan, raising goosebumps on his arms. He had the uncanny sensation that he was missing something obvious, something vital, The boy looked so much like him, and yet he had no memory of this photo being taken. No memory of standing in the rain by a chain-link fence in Tillamook in 1996. He reached for his phone and called Rachel. She would remember. She was 2 years older and had always possessed the more reliable memory between them, keeping track of family events, birthdays, anniversaries. The call went to voicemail. Of course, it was barely 6:30 a.m. Rachel was probably still asleep or getting her kids ready for school. He left a brief message asking her to call him back, mentioning something about old family photos, but keeping his tone casual. No need to worry her unnecessarily. Ethan spent the rest of the morning trying to work, but his concentration was shattered. The rain continued relentlessly, turning the yard into a sodden mess and the street into a shallow river. Twice, he caught himself staring at the photo, trying to force some memory to surface. Around noon, his phone rang, Rachel returning his call. "Hey," she said, ambient noise in the background suggesting she was calling from her car. "What's this about old photos?" Ethan hesitated, suddenly uncertain how to explain the strange sequence of events without sounding unhinged. "Do you remember camping in Tillamook in '96? A pause. "Sure, we went a few times. Dad was obsessed with finding that old military bunker, remember? The one that was supposed to be hidden in the forest." Ethan didn't remember that at all. Military bunker. Yeah, from World War II or something. Coast defense. Dad read about it in one of his history books and got it into his head that we could find it. We never did, though. Did anything strange happen on those trips? The background noise on Rachel's end diminished, suggesting she had parked or pulled over. Strange how? Ethan stared at the photo on his desk. "I'm not sure. Just anything unusual, I guess." Another pause, longer this time. "Eth, what's going on? You're being weird." He sighed. "I found an old photo from Tillamook, 1996. It shows a kid who looks like me standing by a chain-link fence in the rain, but I don't remember it being taken." "A fence? In the forest?" "It doesn't look like the forest. More like some kind of facility." "Huh." Rachel sounded genuinely puzzled. "I don't remember anything like that. Could be from school, a field trip maybe." "Maybe," Ethan conceded, though it didn't feel right. The intensity of the boy's stare in the photo wasn't the casual pose of a school outing. "The weird thing is someone left it at my door this morning. No explanation, no note, just the photo in an envelope." "That is weird." Her tone shifted, became more serious. "Eth, are you okay? First the text about someone in your yard, now this." "I'm fine," he said automatically, though he wasn't sure that was true. "Just tired. It's been raining non-stop and I didn't sleep well." "I want me to come over after work? I can bring dinner." The offer was tempting. Rachel's presence would ground him, provide a counterweight to the strange thoughts spiraling through his mind. But something held him back, a feeling that he needed to figure this out alone, that involving his sister might somehow make things worse. "No need, I'm just being silly. Probably one of the neighbors found an old photo album in their attic and thought the kid looked like me." "If you're sure." She didn't sound convinced. "Call me if you need anything, okay? Even if it's just to talk." "I will," he promised. "Love you, Rach." "Love you too, weirdo." After hanging up, Ethan returned to the photo, studying it with renewed attention. His sister's mention of a military bunker triggered something. A vague recollection of his father, poring over maps in the dim light of a Coleman lantern, pointing to topographical features and explaining defensive strategies to his bored children. But try as he might, he couldn't place the chain-link fence or remember posing for a photo in the rain beside it. The whole scene remained stubbornly unfamiliar, even as the boy's face looked so much like his younger self that it could have been lifted from a family album. The afternoon wore on, the rain never ceasing. Ethan forced himself to complete some work, sending off revised schematics to 2 clients and scheduling calls for the following day. Normal activities that felt increasingly like a performance, a play acting of his usual life, while something else entirely unfolded just beyond his understanding. At 3:45 p.m., he decided to take a break and make a late lunch. As he stood in the kitchen assembling a sandwich, he glanced out the window toward the backyard. The rain had formed small rivulets across the grass, converging into a puddle near the back steps. And there, just visible through the rain-streaked glass, was a pair of footprints in the mud beside the steps. Ethan set down the knife he'd been using to spread mustard and moved closer to the window. The footprints were small, like those of a child or young teenager. They led from the corner of the yard to the back door, but there were no prints leading away. He felt his heart rate accelerate. Someone had approached his house from the backyard, recently, judging by the clarity of the prints in the rain-softened earth. Ethan moved to the back door and checked the lock. Secure. He peered through the glass panel in the door, but saw only his empty, rain-drenched yard. No movement, no figures lurking by the trees or fence line. Then he looked down, and his breath caught in his throat. There, on the mat just inside the door, were two more footprints. Small muddy impressions of bare feet. Someone had been inside his house. The realization struck him like a physical blow. He took an involuntary step back, his mind racing. The security system hadn't been triggered. The door was still locked. How could someone have entered without him knowing? He checked the security app again. No alert since Mrs. Fallow's mysterious appearance in the night. He opened the door and looked at the outside step. More footprints, these slightly faded from the rain, but definitely the same size and shape as those on the inside mat. Ethan closed and locked the door, then moved through the house, checking every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. But the house was empty, just him and the strange muddy footprints that shouldn't have been possible. He returned to the kitchen and stared at the footprints on the mat. They were drying now, the mud beginning to crack and flake. Small feet, narrower than his own, like those of a young teenager, like the boy in the photograph. The thought came unbidden, unwelcome. Ethan tried to dismiss it as absurd, the product of too little sleep and too much isolation. But once formed, it stuck, resonating with an eerie logic that he couldn't quite shake. He took a photo of the footprints with his phone, then carefully cleaned the mat, removing all traces of the mud. As he did, he found himself listening intently to the sounds of the house, trying to detect any hint of movement, any suggestion that he wasn't alone. But there was only the rain, a constant presence that had become almost like another entity in the house with him. By evening, Ethan was exhausted, but too unsettled to consider sleep. He'd spent the afternoon alternating between working and checking the windows, jumping at every creak and settling of the house. The rain had intensified again as darkness fell, driven by a wind that moaned around the eaves and bent the trees in his yard at unnatural angles. He needed distance, perspective. This house, with its strange occurrences and inexplicable footprints, was becoming a pressure chamber of anxiety and confusion. He needed to get away, just for a little while, to clear his head and reset his thinking. That's how Ethan found himself driving to his sister's house in Salem at 8:30 p.m., windshield wipers struggling against the deluge. He hadn't called ahead, partly because he knew Rachel would insist on coming to him if she thought something was wrong, and partly because he wasn't sure he could explain what was happening in a way that wouldn't sound delusional. The trip normally took just under an hour, but with the storm, visibility was poor and there was minor flooding on some of the roads. Ethan drove carefully, hands gripping the steering wheel with unnecessary force as rain hammered the car from all directions. About halfway to Salem, just outside Woodburn, the rain became so heavy that continuing seemed dangerous. Ethan pulled off at a rest stop, a small, poorly lit area with a shuttered information booth, a coffee vending machine and a row of payphones under a flickering canopy. No other vehicles were in sight. He parked near the canopy and shut off the engine, listening to the rain drum against the roof of his car. The sudden silence from the engine made the storm sound even louder, more invasive. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts. What was he doing? Driving to his sister's house in the middle of a storm because of an old photograph and some muddy footprints? It sounded ridiculous when framed that way. And yet, the unease that had been building since that first morning, the sense that something fundamental had shifted in his world, remained, a weight in his chest that wouldn't dissipate no matter how many rational explanations he constructed. Deciding to stretch his legs and maybe get a coffee from the vending machine before continuing on, Ethan grabbed his jacket from the passenger seat and made a dash through the rain to the canopy. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow over the concrete pad. The vending machine hummed in the corner, offering overpriced mediocre coffee in styrofoam cups. As he fed bills into the machine, Ethan noticed a bulletin board mounted on the wall near the restrooms. It was cluttered with the usual assortment of community flyers, missing pet notices, and local event announcements. But one posting caught his eye, a water-warped sheet partially covering a faded advertisement for a Salem farmers market. Ethan stepped closer, squinting in the poor light. It was a photocopied missing persons report, the edges curling from moisture. The text faded but still legible. Missing Julian Caro, age 13. The report was dated July 1996. Caro, his surname. Ethan felt a strange buzzing in his ears, as if all the ambient sounds, the rain, the humming vending machine, the flickering lights, had suddenly receded. He stared at the grainy photo accompanying the report. A boy with unruly dark hair and prominent ears, looking directly at the camera with an unsmiling expression. The same boy from the photograph that had appeared on his doorstep that morning. The text below the photo was partially obscured by water damage, but Ethan could make out fragments. Last seen during family camping trip, Tillamook State. Forrest, wearing blue rain jacket. Any information contact? He reached out with trembling fingers and carefully peeled the notice from the bulletin board. The paper was fragile, disintegrating at the edges, but he managed to remove it intact. The date in the upper corner read, July 17, 1996, Julian Caro. A boy who shared his last name, who looked eerily like him at that age, who had gone missing in the Tillamook Forest in the summer of 1996. A boy Ethan had never heard of. The coffee machine beeped, signaling that his drink was ready, but Ethan ignored it. He folded the missing persons flyer carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket, then returned to his car. The rain seemed to intensify as he sat behind the wheel, staring through the windshield at nothing in particular, his mind racing. He had no memory of a relative named Julian, no recollection of a family member going missing. Surely that would have been a significant event, something discussed, mourned, remembered. His parents had never mentioned another Caro child. Rachel had never spoken of a missing cousin or distant relative. Yet here was evidence of a Julian Caro, a 13-year-old boy who disappeared the same summer that Ethan, also 13, had camped in the Tillamook Forest with his family. A boy who looked so much like him that they could have been twins. Ethan started his car and pulled back onto the highway, heading not towards Salem, but back home. He needed to look at that photograph again, to compare it with the missing persons flyer, to try to make sense of the connection that was forming in his mind, a connection that seemed impossible yet increasingly difficult to dismiss. The return journey passed in a blur of rain and troubled thoughts. By the time Ethan pulled into his driveway, it was nearly 10 p.m., and the storm had developed a rhythmic quality, sheets of water falling in synchronized waves against his windows and roof. He hurried inside, shaking off rain in the entryway, and went directly to his desk where he had left the mysterious photograph. But the desk was empty. No manila envelope, no black and white image of a boy by a chain-link fence. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. He checked the drawers, the nearby shelves, the floor beneath the desk. Nothing. Moving with increasing urgency, he searched the entire first floor, the kitchen counters, the coffee table, the recycling bin, even the trash. The photograph had vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. Ethan stood in the center of his living room, listening to rain pound against the roof, feeling a strange certainty settling over him. The missing photograph, the vanished security footage, Mrs. Fallow's sleepwalking visit, the muddy footprints leading to his door but not away, all connected to the rain, to this endless storm that seemed to be dissolving the boundaries of his normal life. He took the missing persons flyer from his pocket and smoothed it out on the coffee table. The resemblance between Julian Caro and his younger self was uncanny, beyond coincidence, beyond the general similarities that might exist between distant relatives. It was as if someone had taken a photo of Ethan at 13 and labeled it with a different name. His phone rang, startling him. Rachel's name appeared on the screen. "Eth?" Her voice was tight with concern. "Where are you? I tried calling earlier." "I'm home," he said, realizing he'd missed her calls while driving. "Sorry, I was out for a bit. In this weather? Are you crazy?" She paused, then continued, more gently. "I'm worried about you. You haven't sounded like yourself since yesterday." Ethan stared at the missing persons flyer. "Rach, do we have any relatives named Julian?" A beat of silence. "Julian? Not that I know of. Why? What about a cousin or something who went missing when we were kids in Tillamook?" "Missing?" Her voice sharpened. "Ethan, what are you talking about?" He took a deep breath. "I found something, a missing persons report from 1996 for a boy named Julian Caro. He was 13, same as I was that summer. And Rach, he looks exactly like me." "Exactly." The silence on the other end stretched uncomfortably. "Where did you find this report?" she finally asked. "At a rest stop outside Woodburn, on a bulletin board. And you think this boy is related to us somehow?" "I don't know." Ethan ran a hand through his damp hair. "It seems impossible that we'd have a relative who disappeared and nobody ever mentioned it. But the resemblance, it's uncanny. And the same last name, the same forest where we camped that summer." "Ethan," Rachel's voice was measured, careful. "Caro isn't that uncommon a name, and kids do go missing. It's tragic, but it happens. It could be a coincidence." "You haven't seen the photo," he insisted. "It's not just a passing resemblance. This kid could be me." Another pause. "Maybe it is you. Did you consider that? Maybe someone used your photo on a fake missing persons report. A prank or something." Ethan hadn't considered that possibility. "But why? Who would do that?" "I don't know, but it makes more sense than some long-lost twin that nobody ever told us about." She sighed. "Look, I'm coming over tomorrow after work. We'll figure this out together, okay? Just try to get some sleep. You sound exhausted." After hanging up, Ethan sat for a long time staring at the missing persons flyer. Rachel's suggestion that someone had used his photo on a fake report didn't feel right. The paper was old, genuinely weathered, not artificially aged, and the boy in the photo was standing in front of that chain-link fence, the same location as in the mysterious photograph that had appeared on his doorstep that morning. No, there was something else happening here. Something connected to the rain, to this strange week when the normal rules of his life seemed to be dissolving like paper in water. Eventually, fatigue overcame curiosity, and Ethan dragged himself upstairs to bed. He left the missing persons flyer on the coffee table, weighted down with a coaster to prevent it from being blown away by any drafts. As he climbed into bed, he realized he hadn't checked the side gate latch before turning in, a break in his routine that would have been unthinkable just days ago. He fell into a heavy sleep almost immediately, his mind too exhausted to maintain its vigilance. And he dreamed again of standing in his yard in the rain, looking back at his house. But this time there were two figures in the window, himself and a boy who was both familiar and strange, watching him with solemn eyes that seemed to hold a question Ethan couldn't quite hear. The next morning dawned with the storm still raging, the rain now accompanied by a wind that bent trees nearly horizontal and sent debris skittering across roads. Weather alerts buzzed on Ethan's phone when he woke. Flash flood warnings for low-lying areas, cautions about downed power lines and fallen trees. Schools were closed throughout the Portland metro area, and people were advised to stay home if possible. Ethan moved through his morning routine mechanically, his mind still caught in the strange web of connections that had formed over the past days. As he made coffee, he glanced toward the living room, expecting to see the missing persons flyer where he had left it, but the coffee table was empty. The flyer was gone. A cold feeling spread through Ethan's chest. He searched the surrounding area, thinking perhaps the paper had been blown off despite the coaster he'd placed on it. Nothing. It had vanished as completely as the photograph from the day before. Was he losing his mind? Had the flyer ever existed, or had he dreamed that too? The uncertainty was almost worse than the strange events themselves, this growing inability to trust his own perceptions, his own memory. He took his coffee to the front window and stood watching the storm batter his neighborhood. The street resembled a shallow river now, water flowing steadily between the curbs. His yard was a sodden mess, small lakes forming in the lowest areas. The side gate was open again, swinging gently in the wind. Ethan set down his coffee and stared. He was certain he had closed that gate the first morning after finding it mysteriously ajar. Had it blown open in the night? The latch was old, prone to slipping when not properly secured, but as he watched, the gate suddenly stopped its swinging and remained still, despite the wind that continued to thrash the trees and bushes around it. As if someone were holding it in place. Then slowly, deliberately, the gate swung fully open, revealing the side yard beyond. And there, standing just inside the opening, was a figure. Small, slender, dressed in what appeared to be a blue rain jacket with the hood pulled up, obscuring their face. Ethan felt his breath catch. The figure remained motionless for several seconds, then raised a hand, a child's hand, and beckoned to him once before turning and walking further into the yard, disappearing from view. Without consciously deciding to move, Ethan found himself at the front door, pulling on rubber boots kept in the entryway closet. Some part of his mind was screaming that this was madness, that he should call the police, call Rachel, call anyone. But a deeper instinct drove him forward, out into the rain around the side of the house toward the open gate. The yard was transformed by the deluge, familiar features rendered alien by water and shadow. Ethan moved cautiously along the side of the house, rain immediately soaking through his clothes despite the jacket he'd hastily pulled on. The gate stood open, just as he had seen from the window, an invitation or a challenge. He stepped through it into the backyard and stopped. The figure in the blue jacket was standing near the back fence, partially obscured by the rain. Even from this distance, Ethan could see that it was a boy, maybe 12 or 13, slender and not very tall. The hood of the jacket still concealed most of his face. "Hello?" Ethan called, his voice nearly lost in the sound of the storm. "Who are you?" The boy didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked toward the corner of the yard where a massive oak tree stood, its branches thrashing in the wind. As Ethan watched, the boy moved behind the trunk and disappeared. Ethan hurried forward, splashing through puddles that soaked his pants up to the knees. The oak tree was at least 3 feet in diameter, its rough bark darkened by rain. He circled it once, then again, but the yard beyond was empty. The boy had vanished. He stood there, rain pelting him from above, staring at the empty yard. Had he imagined it? Was he so tired, so caught up in the mystery of Julian Caro, that his mind was conjuring images from his subconscious? But no, the gate had been open. That was real. He hadn't imagined that. As Ethan turned to head back to the house, something caught his eye. A flicker of blue beyond his back fence, moving away through the narrow green belt that separated his property from the next street over. He squinted through the rain. The figure in the blue jacket was there, walking steadily away from his yard, following what appeared to be a path through the sodden undergrowth. Without stopping to think, Ethan moved to the back gate, unlatched it, and followed. The green belt was a tangle of blackberry bushes, young alders and invasive ivy, but there was indeed a narrow path winding through it, one Ethan had never noticed in all his years living in the house. The boy in blue was about 50 yards ahead, moving with the confidence of someone following a familiar route. "Wait," Ethan called, pushing through wet branches that slapped at his face and arms. "Please wait." The figure didn't slow or turn. Ethan quickened his pace, stumbling occasionally on the slick, muddy ground. The path led deeper into the green belt, which was wider than Ethan had realized, forming a small wooded area between the housing developments. The rain seemed heavier. Here, filtered through the canopy of trees into large rhythmic drops that struck with surprising force. After several minutes of pursuit, Ethan emerged suddenly onto a narrow access road, a service route for the power lines that cut through the neighborhood. And there, about 100 yards down the road, the boy in the blue jacket stood waiting. His back to Ethan, hood still obscuring his head. Ethan approached cautiously, his heart hammering against his ribs. As he drew nearer, he could see that the boy's jacket was old-fashioned, the kind popular in the mid-90s with reflective strips across the back that caught what little light penetrated the storm clouds. "Who are you?" Ethan asked when he was about 20 feet away. "What do you want?" Slowly the figure turned. The hood fell back slightly, revealing the face beneath, and Ethan felt the world tilt around him, reality shifting like wet sand beneath his feet. It was the boy from the photograph, the boy from the missing persons flyer, Julian Caro. But it was also Ethan himself at 13, the same unruly hair, the same slightly too large ears, the same serious eyes that seemed to hold a question. "You're not real," Ethan whispered, the words immediately swallowed by the rain. "You can't be real." The boy's expression didn't change. He raised his hand again, beckoning, then turned and continued down the access road, his movements deliberate, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. And Ethan followed, drawn by a compulsion beyond rational thought. The access road wound through the wooded area, eventually connecting to a residential street in the next subdivision. The boy in blue walked steadily ahead, always maintaining the same distance, never looking back but somehow conveying an absolute certainty that Ethan was still behind him. They passed through unfamiliar streets, the storm rendering houses and landmarks indistinct, creating a dreamlike quality that made it impossible for Ethan to track their route with any precision. His clothes were soaked through, his hair plastered to his skull, but he barely noticed, focused entirely on the figure ahead, on the impossible boy who wore his face but wasn't him. Eventually they reached a small park, a neighborhood playground, surrounded by trees deserted in the downpour. The boy in blue walked to a picnic shelter at the far end and stopped, finally turning to face Ethan directly as he approached. Under the shelter, partially protected from the rain, Ethan could see the boy clearly for the first time. The resemblance was even more pronounced up close, the shape of the jaw, the set of the eyes, the small scar at the edge of the right eyebrow where Ethan had fallen from a tree at age 10. But there were differences too, subtle variations in expression, a stillness that no living 13-year-old could maintain, a quality to the gaze that seemed both younger and impossibly older than his years. "Julian?" Ethan said, the name feeling strange on his tongue. "Are you Julian Caro?" The boy nodded once, a simple acknowledgement. "But that's impossible," Ethan said. "You disappeared in 1996, and you look like me, like I did then. How is that possible?" Julian didn't speak. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his blue jacket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. He held it out to Ethan, his expression still solemn, unreadable. With trembling fingers, Ethan took the paper and unfolded it. It was the missing persons flyer, the same one he had found at the rest stop, the same one that had vanished from his coffee table that morning. But there was something written on it now. Words, scrawled in blue ink across the bottom margin. "The rain makes doors." "You opened one?" Ethan looked up, confused. "What does that mean? What doors?" Julian glanced toward the park, toward a concrete drainage tunnel partially visible at the edge of the playground. Then he looked back at Ethan, the question in his eyes becoming more urgent, more focused. Do you want me to help you?" Ethan asked, struggling to understand. "Are you lost?" A small, sad smile touched Julian's lips, an expression so familiar that Ethan felt it like a physical pain in his chest. The boy shook his head, then pointed at Ethan, then at himself, then made a gesture that seemed to encompass everything around them: the park, the rain, the world. "I don't understand," Ethan said, frustration edging into his voice. "Please, just tell me what you want." Julian's expression turned somber again. He looked at Ethan for a long moment, as if making a decision. Then he turned and walked out from under the shelter, back into the rain, heading toward the drainage tunnel. Ethan followed, the missing persons flyer clutched in his hand. The playground equipment gleamed wetly as they passed, swings moving gently in the wind, slides slick with rainwater. The drainage tunnel loomed ahead, a concrete arch about 4 feet high, leading beneath a small rise in the landscape. Water flowed steadily from its mouth, forming a shallow stream across the park. Julian stopped at the entrance to the tunnel and looked back at Ethan, that same urgent question in his eyes. Then he ducked down and entered the tunnel, disappearing into the shadows beyond. Ethan hesitated at the entrance. Following a strange boy into a drainage tunnel during a storm was madness by any rational standard, and yet nothing about the past 3 days had been rational. Nothing about Julian Caro, this impossible boy who wore his face, followed the rules of normal reality. Taking a deep breath, Ethan crouched and entered the tunnel. The sound of water became amplified in the enclosed space, echoing off concrete walls covered in faded graffiti. Julian was about 10 feet ahead, a silhouette against the dim light filtering in from the other end. The tunnel extended for about 30 yards, gradually curving to the right. As Ethan followed Julian deeper, the light from the entrance faded, leaving them in a strange twilight, broken only by the occasional flash of lightning visible through drainage grates above. Halfway through, Julian stopped and turned to face a section of wall that appeared no different from any other part of the tunnel. He placed his hand against the concrete and looked back at Ethan expectantly. "There's nothing there," Ethan said, moving closer. "Just the wall." Julian shook his head and pressed more firmly against the concrete, and to Ethan's astonishment, the boy's hand seemed to sink into the wall, as if the solid surface had become permeable, like water. Ethan stumbled back a step, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Julian withdrew his hand from the wall, intact, apparently unharmed, and once again gestured for Ethan to follow. Then he leaned forward and stepped into the wall, his body passing through the concrete, as if it were merely an illusion, disappearing completely from view. For several seconds, Ethan stood frozen, staring at the spot where Julian had vanished. The rational part of his mind insisted that this was a hallucination, a dream, perhaps even a psychotic break. People didn't walk through walls. 13-year-old boys who looked exactly like you didn't lead you through rainstorms to drainage tunnels. None of this was real, and yet... Ethan approached the wall cautiously, extending his hand toward the spot where Julian had disappeared. His fingers met solid concrete, unyielding exactly as expected. He pressed harder, feeling slightly ridiculous, but the wall remained impenetrable. He was about to turn away when he noticed something, a slight shimmer in the air adjacent to where he was touching, like heat rising from asphalt on a summer day. And he remembered Julian's words on the flyer. "The rain makes doors. You opened one." Ethan looked down at his soaking wet clothes, at the water pooling around his feet in the tunnel. Rain. He was covered in it, saturated with it. Julian had been similarly drenched, his blue jacket darkened by water. It was insane, but he placed both hands against the wall, letting the rainwater from his sleeves run down the concrete surface. And as the water flowed, he felt the wall seemed to soften beneath his palms, becoming less substantial, more permeable. Taking a deep breath, Ethan leaned forward, pushing against the wall with increasing pressure. For a moment, resistance, then a strange giving way, as if he were pushing through a membrane. His hands, then arms, then face, passed through what looked like solid concrete, but felt more like heavy curtains. And then he was through, stumbling, forward into a space that shouldn't exist. A narrow passage extending beyond the confines of the drainage tunnel, illuminated by a diffuse light that seemed to have no source. The air was different here, not the damp chill of the storm, but something warmer, charged with a strange energy that made the hair on Ethan's arms stand up. Julian stood a few yards ahead, watching him with that same intense gaze. When he saw that Ethan had made it through, he nodded once, then turned and continued down the passage. The walls around them were not concrete, but something less defined, a surface that seemed to shift and flow like water when viewed from the corner of the eye, but appeared solid when looked at directly. The floor beneath their feet felt firm enough, though it had the slightly yielding quality of wet sand. They walked for what felt like minutes, but could have been longer. Time seemed distorted in this strange, impossible space. The passage occasionally branched, but Julian never hesitated, choosing directions with the confidence of someone following a familiar route. Finally, they emerged into a larger area, a circular chamber about 20 feet across, with what appeared to be doorways spaced evenly around its circumference. Each doorway led to another passage, identical to the one they had just traversed. In the center of the chamber stood a small pedestal, and on it rested a book, old, bound in dark leather, its pages visibly water-damaged even from a distance. Julian walked to the pedestal and gestured for Ethan to approach. As Ethan drew closer, he could see that the book was open to a page filled with names written in various hands, in ink of different colors and ages. Some were faded almost to invisibility. Others appeared relatively recent. Julian pointed to a name near the bottom of the right-hand page. Julian Caro, July 15, 1996. "That's you," Ethan said quietly. "The day you disappeared." Julian nodded, then pointed to a blank space just below his name. "You want me to sign it?" Ethan asked, confused. "Why? What is this place?" Instead of answering, Julian reached out and touched Ethan's chest, directly, over his heart. The contact sent a jolt through Ethan, not painful but intense, like static electricity multiplied 100-fold. And in that moment, understanding flooded his mind, not in words but in images, sensations, fragments of memory that weren't his own. He saw Julian walking through the Tillamook forest in the rain, separating from his hiking group to explore a drainage culvert beneath a forest service road. He felt the boy's curiosity as he discovered that the back wall of the culvert had softened in the heavy rain, becoming a door to somewhere else. He experienced Julian's wonder as he explored the passages beyond, his growing alarm as he realized he couldn't find his way back, and finally his acceptance as days stretched into weeks, into years, and the passages became his home. But more than that, Ethan understood what Julian was offering him. A choice, a chance to step away from the life he had been living, with its quiet routines and growing isolation, into something different. Not better, not worse, just other. A parallel existence in this place where rain made doors between worlds, where time moved differently, where the boundaries between what was and what might have been grew thin enough to cross. "You want me to stay here?" Ethan said, the realization both terrifying and strangely compelling. "To take your place while you... what? Move on? Go back?" Julian shook his head, then gestured to encompass both of them. Then the chamber with its many doorways, neither staying nor going, but something else, a merging perhaps, or a trading of places, or simply a recognition that they were in some fundamental way aspects of the same existence, separated by a twist of fate in the rain. Ethan looked around the chamber, at the doorways leading to who knew where, at the book with its litany of names stretching back through time. Then he looked at Julian, this boy who was and wasn't him, who had stepped through a door in the rain and found himself in a place between places. "If I sign," he said slowly, "what happens then?" Julian smiled, that same small, sad smile that Ethan had seen in the park. Then he pointed to one of the doorways, one that seemed to shimmer slightly more than the others, as if disturbed by a breeze, a way back. Not to the life Ethan had been living, perhaps, but to a life in the world. He knew Julian was offering him a choice: stay and explore this strange place, or return to a reality that might be slightly different from the one he had left. Rain makes doors, Ethan thought. You opened one. But doors swing both ways. They can be closed as well as opened. Passages can lead out as well as in. Ethan looked at the blank space below Julian's name in the book. Then he looked at the boy, this other version of himself who had taken a different path in the rain all those years ago, and he made his choice. 3 days later, Rachel Caro stood on her brother's porch, ringing the doorbell for the third time. The storm had finally broken that morning, the rain stopping for the first time in nearly a week. Sunlight gleamed on wet surfaces, transforming the world into a glistening, renewed version of itself. "Ethan?" she called, knocking firmly. "Are you in there? You haven't been answering your phone." The door opened, revealing her brother, hair slightly tousled, a mug of coffee in his hand, looking surprisingly well-rested for someone who had sounded so troubled the last time they spoke. "Rach," he said, smiling warmly. "Sorry, I was in the backyard. Come in." She studied him as she entered the house, noting subtle differences, a new ease in his posture, a lightness in his expression. that she hadn't seen in years. "You seem better," she said cautiously. He laughed, a genuine sound that startled her with its openness. "I am better. Something about the storm breaking, I guess. Everything feels clearer now." Rachel followed him into the kitchen, where he poured her a cup of coffee. "I was worried," she admitted. "You were talking about missing persons reports and mysterious photographs." "Yeah, about that," he said, shaking his head ruefully. "I was overtired and the storm was making me crazy. Turns out there's a logical explanation for everything." "Oh!" She accepted the coffee, still watching him closely. The photo that showed, up at my door, a mix-up by the postal service. It was meant for Mrs. Fallow, a picture of her nephew from back in the day. The missing persons flyer was just something I saw online while researching Tillamook history. My mind connected dots that weren't really there. It sounded reasonable, but something about his delivery felt rehearsed, as if he were reciting rather than explaining. And there was something else, a subtle difference in his speech patterns, in the way he held his mug, in how he leaned against the counter. Small things that most people wouldn't notice, but Rachel had known her brother all his life. "Well, I'm glad you're feeling better," she said carefully. "Though I've got to say, you seem different somehow." He smiled again, that new, lighter smile. "Do I? I guess the storm changed a few things, helped me see things from a different perspective." Rachel nodded, sipping her coffee. "Speaking of perspective, did you ever find that old photo album? From the Tillamook trips? The one with the pictures of you and me and Dad fishing in the rain?" Ethan's expression flickered almost imperceptibly, a moment of uncertainty quickly masked. "Not yet," he said, "but I'll keep looking. It's got to be around here somewhere." Rachel murmured noncommittally. "Well, no rush. Maybe we can look for it together next time I visit. Those pictures of you at 13 were priceless, especially the one where you fell in the creek and Dad had to fish you out." Another flicker, more noticeable this time. "Right, the creek, that was quite a day." Rachel set down her mug. There had been no creek, no falling in, no fishing out. She had fabricated the memory entirely, and her brother, or whoever this was, had accepted it without question. "Ethan," she said quietly, "what happened during the storm?" He met her gaze steadily, that new lightness still present in his eyes, but now tinged with something else, a knowledge, a secret kept just behind his smile. "The rain makes doors, Rach," he said simply. "Sometimes we walk through them without even realizing it, and sometimes we choose to." Outside, the sun continued to shine on the rain-washed world, light glinting off puddles that would soon evaporate, leaving no trace of the paths they had briefly, fleetingly, impossibly opened. If this story kept you wondering until the end, hit like and subscribe. The next one might be waiting for you right now. And there's one more, waiting just there on the side. Maybe it will explain what was missing from this one. Maybe it will make everything worse.